And I am hitting record. Welcome, everybody. I'm Chad Coulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber, and we are so thrilled to be joined once again by David Schultz, the professor from Hamline University. This is the third time we've had him this year, and the timing has ended up being perfect. I want to first recognize our sponsor today. Bill Geyer is going to be speaking. He represents both Finance and Commerce and Minnesota Lawyer. Bill.
Thanks, Chad. On behalf of Finance and Commerce and Minnesota Lawyer, I would also like to thank David Schultz for joining us today. Really looking forward to his insight. I imagine you've been really busy over the last week or so, trying to keep track of every minute's move. My quick plug for Minnesota Lawyer is this: if you want fact-based reporting on what's going on in the legal community and at the state capitol, check us out at minlawyer.com. And if you're not following Kevin Featherly on Twitter, he's our reporter. He's based in the Capitol. He's very familiar with Mr. Schultz and vice versa. And I think I'll say this unbiased. I think if you ever listen to any of the legislative calls, Kevin asks some of the best questions. He has some of the most direct questions of any reporters out there. So give Kevin a listen at Kevin Featherly. And on behalf of Minnesota Lawyer, welcome, David, and we're happy to sponsor today.
Yeah, if I could just sort of interject for a second here, at a time when so many publications and the news, is pulling back on Capitol reporters, you have probably the best coverage. I say that, by the way. I've been reading your publication for I can't tell you how many years. It's the best sort of publication for finding out what's actually going on at the state capitol of anything out there.
Well, I appreciate your saying that, and we owe that to Kevin. He's a workhorse over there.
He is.
Well, thank you, Bill. And, normally this is the part of the program where I read a somewhat long speaker bio, but I feel like David Letterman here when I can say our next speaker needs no introduction. Having been here for a third time this year, people are very familiar with him. You may have caught some of his election coverage. He also has a blog that you should check out called Schultz's Take. He's a professor of political science at Hamline University. He's drinking out of a Midway Chamber of Commerce mug right now. Please welcome David Schultz.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And what I'm entitling, I think my talk today is called "A Divided Country Waits." And I think, unfortunately, that may be capturing a lot of what we're doing here in terms of capturing the America where we are right now. And what I want to do is talk for a little while, but I want to leave plenty of opportunity for questions, because I suspect, as we've done before, I think the best part is always the Q&A. And then two, there's a variety of things that you're probably just intensely interested in that we should really talk about here. But what I'm going to do is sorry, just finished teaching 2 classes. What I'm going to argue is that there's a small cluster of themes that really define the election this year, and I want to talk about today. And they weave, by the way, through all of my discussion. One of them is going to be to say that that we entered this election as an incredibly divided country, and it looks like we're exiting this election as a very divided country. So I'm going to come back and talk about all those divisions in a few minutes here. The second reminds me of a cartoon. Second point I want to make. There's a cartoon from a very long time ago. Shows you how long ago it was. It's a situation where when pollsters used to go door to door to ask people's public opinion. And it's a scene of a pollster knocking on a door, and he's barking out to the question to the resident, if the election were held today, and the person yells back and says, I would be, if the election were held today, the person said, I'd be really grateful. And the point that I'm getting at here is that the elections are not quite over yet. And we're still having to deal with some of them in terms of the fact that officially the presidential election is not over. We also know that the US Senate races are not over because we have a couple of races still to deal with in Georgia. I'm also going to argue, completely to your surprise, that the 2020 elections unfolded largely as predictable. And you're going to say, what do you mean as predictable? And then I want to get into some discussion about where the legal challenges are right now. And I think the important stuff to remember is there's public policies that flow from the election. So we want to think about that. All right, so let me take you back approximately about 1 year. And by the way, again, I noticed you put in here, so make sure if you have questions, put them in chat or whatever like that. About a year ago, about December of 2019, I was starting to think about the third edition of my presidential swing states book that I had been writing for the last few years, and making an argument that in general, that presidential elections are largely over before they start. And you've heard me talk about this, I think, in the past at the chamber, where I've said that, because of the existence of the Electoral College, because it's all or nothing, or rather winner take all for electoral votes in 48 out of 50 states, and because of the fact that we're so polarized and so partisan right now, it's rare that people cross-party vote or split ticket vote anymore. What I've argued for quite a while is that we know how some states are just going to vote. We know how New York's going to vote in the presidential election, how Washington is going to vote, how California, Louisiana, Texas, and so forth like that. So when I was putting together sort of a possible list last October of what chapters I think I wanted in my third edition of my swing states book, I sat down and did some calculations. And this is the part where I thought it became really kind of interesting about predictable, is that last December, I said, based upon what the numbers looked like then, I said the presidential election was over already in 43 states. That we already knew what was going to happen. Again, we knew what was going to happen in the New Yorks, Californias, Massachusetts, Utahs, et cetera, et cetera. And my starting point back then was to say that in those 43 states, we could make some pretty good calculations also. Now, this is either dumb luck or a really good prediction. About a year ago, I said it would probably be Joe Biden. That seemed pretty likely that it was going to be Joe Biden. And at least 2 years ago, I said Kamala Harris would be vice presidential pick for whomever. So I was pretty much guessing it would be Biden and Harris about a year ago. We knew it was going to be Trump and Pence. So what I did is approximately December of last year, as I said, Biden and Harris start with about 222 electoral votes in terms of states they're going to win, and that we would see Donald Trump with about 205 electoral votes approximately. And I said it would be down to really and by the way, you need 270 electoral votes to win. So I said neither of them had it in the bag at this point, that there was going to be 7 states that the presidential election would be all about. It would be about Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those 7 states have 111 electoral votes, and I said the battle for the presidency will be in those states. Additionally, and I think I've talked about this before you folks before, is that within those 7 states, I thought that, we've known that there's only certain counties that truly matter, and that candidates campaign in those counties. These are the counties that are either so populous or so bellwetherish, that's a word, bellwetherish, that they determine the election. And so I said in places like, for example, like Philadelphia County in Pennsylvania, or Allegheny County, or maybe Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is Lackawanna County, or places, for example, like Oakland or Wayne County in Michigan, or Maricopa County, Phoenix in Arizona. And so when I started this election, I said maybe it comes down to just a few counties. And additionally, we know because we're so polarized, we're so partisan, that there's very few people who cross-ticket vote anymore, very few people who split-ticket vote. The election would likely come down to a small number of swing voters and within those few counties, within those few states. So last December, I said, The key to understanding the election were four numbers: 10, 11, 7, 270. 10% of the voters located in 11 counties dispersed across 7 states would determine who gets the 270 electoral votes. In real numbers, I was saying this could very well be less than what? I don't know, 50, 60,000 voters that really decided the election. Actually, at one point, I had a wonderful high school student from Lakeville work with me a couple summers ago, and we looked at the precinct level data, and we actually thought that there was only a few precincts that mattered. Anyhow, the student was kidding with me, and she's saying, "Are we down to the point where it's just how Harry and Louise vote on Elm Street in Detroit determine the election?" And I said, "It's getting to be that bad, where there's just so few people who really matter." And that speaks of the polarization. I think I've also, we talked about just underscoring the polarization, and I'll come back to these numbers again here, is that the polarization is so severe in our country. And some of you have heard me talk about this before, that it's not just the different news services that we consume, it's the restaurants we shop at, it's the our restaurants we eat at, the stores we shop at, et cetera, et cetera. One of my favorite stories for the last few years is to say that if we took a map of where Democrats versus Republicans did well, and then map that along with the location of Whole Foods stores, Chick-fil-A restaurants, and Cracker Barrel restaurants, we would get a nearly perfect prediction of the election. Again, all speaking to what? Predictability, to polarization. So I thought, 10, 11, 7, 270 was the key. I thought that there would be perhaps even fewer states, but a year ago I said those states. Okay, so now either speaking to good luck, predictability, or whatever, I put together the index for my book saying, well, we should throw in, these approximately 7 states. I threw a few others in too. I also said, well, maybe Georgia is a possibility to be a swing state. The numbers are moving in that direction. I said, nah, I don't think it will be. It won't swing for 4 more years, but just in case, I'll throw it in. And then also said, well, Nebraska's kind of odd. It's one of those 2 states in the country that doesn't do winner take all, that instead, maybe because Omaha went as a separate congressional district for Obama years ago, maybe it'll go for Biden this time. So I threw that in. Anyhow, the point being is about a year in advance of the election, I had us down to a small cluster of about 7 or 8, maybe 9 states that would matter. And if we looked at the general election this year, guess what? From roughly Labor Day until Election Day, those are about 2 weeks before Election Day, those were the states that mattered. Now, it obviously was an odd campaign season. We're going to come back to this in a few minutes here. But for the most part, it did revolve around those states. Somewhere around a month ago, Minnesota dropped out of that. That it became clear to me that Minnesota was going to go for Biden. The poll numbers were suggesting that, and that might speak to someone who wants to ask later questions about polling. I also became pretty convinced that Biden wasn't going to win Florida, wasn't going to win North Carolina, and I didn't think he was going to win Arizona either. I said, these are states that are probably not going to happen. Was surprised about Georgia, but again, the demographics were changing. He was polling competitively in Texas, but as somebody who used to live in Texas, I thought, not too soon for Texas also. So up until about let's say second week of October, it was 7 or 8 or 9 states that the presidential race was all about. But then, so that's perfectly predictable. Then, and we knew this, the candidates were campaigning there. That's where the polls were. Everything was focused there. But then about the second week of October, it reduced even more. It got down to what? The 3 states potentially that mattered 4 years ago. Remember, 4 years ago, it was about Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. It was about how in those 3 states, had Secretary Clinton picked up 85,000 more votes across those 3 states, how she would be running for president for her second term right now. What we knew back then 4 years ago was that in critical urban counties, again, Wayne County, Milwaukee County, places like that, the voting was down. Now we were starting to look at signs in 2020, second week or so of October, that these 3 states, again, were going to become the 3 states that mattered. We again could look at it even more microscopically and realize that what? It was going to come down to what? Wayne County, Oakland County in Michigan, a cluster of counties such as Allegheny, Philadelphia, Bucks County in Pennsylvania. It was going to still come down to perhaps Milwaukee proper. All this by saying that what? Entirely predictable in terms of where it moved. And then in the last closing days, it came down to Pennsylvania. So all of this, again, sounds predictable. But now, of course, Chad turns to me and says, yeah, but Schultz, a year ago, you didn't see the pandemic. You didn't see the economy. You didn't see all these things. And the answer is yes, you're right. However, I always knew that this was going to be an election all about one thing, Donald Trump. At the end of the day, this was going to be an election that's a referendum on him. Why? Second term elections are always referendums on the president. And more so than probably any other president we've had in recent history, Trump's personality was going to be on trial or on the election ballot. It was all about him in 2018. 2016, it was about Hillary Clinton. He pushed it off. And I'm going to get to the question about Minnesota in a few minutes here too, by the way, because it is an odd state. We live in an odd state for a lot of reasons. Besides the fact that 2 days ago, I'm sitting out in the sun in 75 degrees and now it's snowing, but that's another story entirely. But the sense in which we saw how several new events came in place. But what's fascinating, again, speaking to our polarization, how the pandemic, how George Floyd, how the economy really became what? Surrogates for how you thought about Donald Trump. That if you were a Democrat, you were what? More likely to say that the pandemic was his fault, that race was an issue, that the economy was his fault. If you were a supporter of Donald Trump, and we're going to get to that question about the litigation in a few minutes here, by the way. And if you were a Republican or a Trump supporter, you were more likely to give the president a pass on those issues and say, this is something that was unforeseen. So those events, yes, potentially issues in of themselves, but really I still think were surrogates in terms of what we thought about Donald Trump. Where I do think especially the pandemic kicked in, was in terms of accelerating a trend that had already been going on in our society for the last few years, early voting. That many states every state had had an experience, all had had absentee voting, all allowed for voting by mail for absentee. Many states like Minnesota were expanding early voting for a variety of reasons. And this is what happened also, is that the pandemic just exploded the percentage of people who wanted to vote early. In some states, there was litigation, including in Minnesota, to try to make it easier to early vote or return ballots because of the concerns of what we saw in Wisconsin when it had its primary back in April and people stood in long lines and got infected. So this became interesting, but also like everything else, early voting became polarized. Donald Trump criticized vote by mail as fraudulent, as corrupt. Democrats embraced it. And so we were thinking that what would happen by election day is that we would have a lot of Democrats voting early, taking advantage of it, versus Republicans not. And that set us up potentially for what? A couple of different numbers for understanding the election. What happened before election day, what happened after election day, or happened on election day. So we also knew by looking at early requests for absentees and where they were, and when they were being processed, they were coming from what? Those critical counties across the country where Democrats didn't turn out to vote 4 years ago, but now were turning out to vote, including in places like what? Hennepin, and Ramsey County. I should, by the way, just do a quick, I know I'm not stealing, I hope I'm not stealing this, but I'm going to do a quick little promo. There's going to be a piece that comes out later this week in the Star Tribune. I was interviewed for it. Ramsey County might very well have had the highest voter turnout in the United States, and we should be proud of that. The numbers are looking like our voter turnout was somewhere between 80 and 85%. I mean, that's off the Geiger counter. So we should all feel really good about the fact that, you know, we have a really civically minded county, and most of it driven by St. Paul, by the way, too. But again, that story will be coming out later this week about that. But anyhow, what we saw going into election day then, and this is all important to understand here, is that we had about 100 million voters vote in advance. And of those 100 million, we also know, I say bravo, Ramsey County too. We also know that in many states in the country, about half the states don't count absentee ballots as they're coming in. By law, they can't be counted until after the elections or the polls close on election day. And that included Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Right. So if you were like me, I was working for the Minnesota News Network, the radio station. We broadcast across the state on election night. And so I'm in their offices, and you probably saw the same thing that I did. Early in the night, Biden goes ahead in Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia. I know people who are Democrats are like joyful. People who are Republicans are eating antacids like there's no tomorrow, thinking, oh my God, this is going to be really bad. Then the numbers start to flip and Trump goes in the lead. Same thing then happens with, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Early numbers come in, Biden has a lead, and then they all flip. By the time it gets to be about midnight, 12:30, Democrats are kind of depressed, thinking, my gosh, they haven't won the election. Then there's Arizona. Arizona is ahead for Biden. And he's doing fairly well. All right. Now, why all this is important is that by the time many of us sort of went to bed, and I say sort of went to bed early Wednesday morning, we had returns that looked one way, but those returns were mostly capturing the votes that had been cast in person on election day. They weren't capturing all the early voting or absentees. And what we started to then see on the course of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday into Saturday, as all those ballots were being counted, they were mostly from what? The Democratic areas. And they flipped all those critical states. So that by the time we got to what was it, midday on Saturday, enough states had flipped that it looked like what? Biden had won. And I'm going to say look like because Biden's the unofficial winner. And we're going to come back to that in a minute here. All right. So I want to stay with this notion here that think about the themes here so far, the predictability of the election, that it did come down to in many ways, mostly the same states that I thought about, a year ago, a small cluster of states. It then reduced down to what? Those three critical states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Eventually, many people said it came down just to Pennsylvania. So everything sort of went along the way that we all thought it was going to, within a highly partisan and polarized atmosphere, despite the fact that we've had a pandemic, George Floyd, and an economic sort of collapse in the process here. All right, so now let's also think about where this goes litigation-wise in the next few days. I'll come back to some questions here. Then I, of course, want to get to some of the state stuff in terms of where to think about it here also. All right, so now the returns have come in, and I talked about this in one of my classes yesterday. Remember right now, nothing is official. By tradition, Associated Press is given the unofficial crown to generally declare who's the winner in states and presidential elections and who's the overall winner. So we have AP involved, but Fox National News was making some predictions, as was CNN. Remember, none of this truly matters. It's unofficial. What just sort of remind you folks of some critical deadlines here, which is going to be important to my legal analysis, is that approximately 2 weeks after every election, state canvassing boards will meet. 2 weeks from election day until after until the canvassing board meets, states are routinely cleaning up the numbers, maybe doing some recounts, maybe just adjusting some mistakes, finding ballots that people had maybe cast at home, sent them in, but they're coffee, they're coated with coffee and they didn't read well. They've got to sort of tabulate them, et cetera, et cetera. So approximately next Monday, which is the 16th, is when the canvassing boards will meet to certify the election in all the states. Approximately, some states are about 3 weeks out. When the canvassing boards meet, they will certify the election results and issue election certificates declaring the winner. At that point, I presume Joe Biden will be the official nominee. By that point, I'm presuming that also Biden will have won Georgia, putting him at 309 electoral votes, which is where I think he's going to be. A second critical deadline, I want to mention these deadlines so you know them, will be on the 8th of December. December 8th is a date sketched in federal law. And what December 8th says is that if a state has resolved all of its controversies regarding its electoral votes by that date, then if there's any disputes when Congress meets to review the electoral votes, presumption of validity will be given to the state's count. Third date, the 14th of December. That's when the electors meet to cast their ballots. That's by federal law. Next date, it's in the Constitution, January 6th, 2021. That's when a joint session of Congress meets to validate and count the electoral votes to declare a winner. And then the last date is January 20th, 2021 at noon. That's when the present terms expire for the president and vice president, and upon oath, the new terms take place. Okay. The reason why I mention all of this, these dates are important. We know the president has said he's going to sue and is making several charges. I want to kind of walk us through them, but the simple answer I'm going to give is that it's unlikely any of these legal challenges will change the election. Pretty unlikely. And again, I'm still going to get to these questions here in about 2 minutes here. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of them here. Is that we know in the case of, let's say, Georgia and Wisconsin, where recounts are occurring, recounts generally don't change the initial count by very much. Yeah, I know we have an experience of Frank and Coleman in the state, a very close race, but generally statewide recounts don't change the total number of votes by more than 200-300, which speaks to how accurate our original counts are. Unlikely the president wins on recounting. Not impossible, but unlikely. But what he wants to argue, his primary argument, is that there's a violation of federal law going on here. And what his argument is that there's another federal law in place, and it's called the Federal Uniform Election Day Act. And what that law says, it's a cumbersome law, but the law says federal elections take place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Now, whoever came up with that as an expression for the law, I have no idea, but we won't go into that discussion here. That means for our purposes, February 3rd. What he wants to argue is that ballots that were cast before Election Day by absentee or by mail, but which were received by Election Day, but which were counted after Election Day, should not be considered valid because they violate the Federal Uniform Election Day law. That's also his main argument when he says there's voter fraud, that all this early voting that's occurring is fraudulent or it's corrupted or it's voter fraud because what? These ballots are being counted after Election Day. That argument is pretty unlikely to win. 20 states in the country have laws that say ballots are counted after Election Day. We've been doing this for many, many years. I know Brett Kavanaugh may not like that, has indicated he may think there's a violation there, but in general, I think all those early votes are going to count. Additionally, he's argued that the voting that takes place where people postmark the ballot by election day, but they're received after election day, shouldn't count. Well, so far, Biden's victories have not included those ballots. Then there's a variety of what I call garden variety sort of claims. I'm trying not to make fun of anybody, but there's like somebody who's claiming in Pennsylvania, for example, that ballots are coming in pizza boxes. People are like bringing in with pizza to be counted. I heard another story that said somebody's shipping in ballots from one state that doesn't need them to another state in order to cast votes. Again, none of this has been proven. So far, judges have rejected all these claims and have said there's no foundation, there's no support for them whatsoever. Not to say he won't be able to support them, but so far, he's not been successful. So for the most part, I think these suits are not going to prevail. But even if they do, it's going to be a tough battle. I've had some people argue that this is just Florida 2000 all over again. This is Bush v. Gore all over again. And it's not. Bush v. Gore was about reading the intention of ballots, trying to figure out, remember all the stories of people holding up their piece of paper, can't see it here, trying to figure out what a dimpled Chad is, what things like that, a pregnant Chad, all those different phrases. That's about one state in a very close election about ascertaining voter intent. Here, it's about several states. Trump would have to, at this point, reverse the election returns in at least 3 states, if not more, to change the outcome of the election. That's pretty unlikely. Moreover, courts are hesitant to throw out an election, and especially they've never thrown out a presidential election. If in fact, even the president can show some corruption, some fraudulent ballots, what the courts generally do is to say, okay, how many ballots are fraudulent versus what was the total margin of victory, subtract them. And so let's say in Wisconsin, Biden has 22,000 vote margin of victory. Let's say 10,000 ballots are thrown out as fraud. That still leaves a 12,000 vote victory. So it's pretty unlikely that the president's going to prevail on any of these. And so I really don't see the president litigating his way to a victory at this point. And so for the most part, I'm about as confident as I can possibly be that Biden prevails in terms of, okay, I want to run through a few questions here, then I want to come back and talk about some of the state stuff and so forth like that. And so I'm going to just scroll back into the chat box here for a second. Okay, so one of them is, what caused Minnesota to no longer be considered a swing state? It's a fascinating, at the statewide level, we don't seem to be a statewide swing state anymore. Remember, the last time a Republican won statewide office in Minnesota or a statewide election was Governor Pawlenty in 2006. The last time a Republican presidential candidate won the state was 1972 with Richard Nixon. At the state level, we seem to be somewhat solidly Republican or Democratic for now. About 55 to 57% of the electorate in the state now comes from the metro region. But if we look below the state level, what's fascinating is several things. We came into this election as the only state in the country with a divided state legislature. One chamber controlled by one party, the other controlled by another. Guess what? We're still the only state in the country that has one chamber controlled by one party, one by another. So we get to sort of either jump up and down and say great for divided government or poo, for divided government. But we're the only state in the country that has a divided legislature. At below the state level, we've got very distinct patterns of where Democrats do well, very distinct patterns where Republicans do well, and those areas overlap. And so in terms of a swing state, I still would not rule out the fact that we could be potentially a swing state in the future, although the demographics are starting to work against it, that we're seeing more and more people leave the rural areas. We're seeing the percentage of white working class without a college degree, which is the core sort of base for Donald Trump, that percentage is going down over time. But it just becomes an interesting question now that we are swingy-ish, if I can use that word, swingish within the state and competitive, but not at the national level. I still need to look at more data to figure this out as I write my chapter for my swing states book. Okay, what are the implications for redistricting based on Minnesota's divided government compared to Wisconsin? Again, this is going to be fascinating because we do know, well, we're going to know probably in the next few weeks if we lose a congressional seat. The unfortunate reality is we're probably going to lose a congressional seat, which has an impact in terms of electoral college, representation in Congress, but also in terms of what the billions of dollars that means that we're not going to get over the next few years. I should also mention the fact by Colin Peterson losing and we're losing the chair of the House Ag Committee, that potentially also means billions of dollars to the ag industry that doesn't necessarily come in by losing that chairpersonship. But we'll think about that down the line here. But the fact that we're going to lose a seat and the fact that congressional seat, that we're going to have to redraw the congressional lines next year as well as the state legislative, I think just about guarantees that the Minnesota Supreme Court draws the lines again. You know, that had it been unified government, Democrats taking everything plus having the governorship, it would have been more likely that the lines would have been gerrymandered in favor of the Democrats, and that perhaps the Democrats would have targeted one of the Republican seats for elimination, of which I still think is going to happen anyhow, in terms of what may happen. This now decreases that chance where the courts are going to probably draw the seats that are somewhat more fair. How fair, I don't know, but they certainly won't be as gerrymandered. How long do I think the litigation will last? December 8th, which is why I brought up those dates. That one of the legacies of Bush v. Gore, people might remember when the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, halted the recount in Florida. And it did so because it said that for the state to be able to take advantage of that safe harbor provision, the recount had to be done before whatever the date was back then. I think it was December 12th. I think the court will do the same thing here. Any litigation is going to be done before December 8th, maybe sooner than that, but by December 8th at the latest, because the courts are going to want to say that we want to let the states be able to participate in that safe harbor provision, to be able to cast their electoral votes. So I think it's unlikely to go beyond that. Do you agree with me? Okay, I'm going to scroll down here. That one reason people find it so hard to split their ballot is that because candidates have become so pre-committed to a party agenda, prompts how they vote. Yeah, I actually do. I mean, I think, especially we know for younger people are less, as by Gen Zs and the millennials. And we don't know, of course, for the alphas yet. You know, that's the generation that's like maybe 7 years old right now, 8 years old. They're less wedded to the two-party. I call the two parties two different restaurants with two different menus. And those new generations are less enamored by the menus for both of them. But I think it's true to some extent that and again, in a different talk that I've given, I've talked about how our parties have become so ideologically cohesive now. I mean, you can't be pro-life and a Democrat or pro-choice and a Republican. You can't be, it's almost impossible to say that I'm a Republican who's fiscally conservative, but I believe in support of LGBTQ rights or something like that. I mean, it's like the menus just don't fit together anymore. And I think this has sort of caused a problem for split ticket anymore because of this rigidity. And so you wind up going with the party that sort of best aligns with what you think are the most important issues. But at least from my perspective, I'm not completely satisfied with the way that menu is set up. Again, Bravo Ramsey County. What why are we so polarized? How can we end this and work together? What are the areas that we have in common? Um, um, Polarized, I think mostly, I mean, the longer term story is what's polarized America, or the issues of civil rights, um, 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 LGBTQ issues, reproductive rights. These have been major issues that have resorted the parties along race, along religion. Again, much longer story here to tell than I can probably do today, but they've had the biggest sort of impact in terms of what's happened here. I'm going to briefly mention again, I don't want to give away completely the article in the Star Tribune, but Ramsey County has lots of things going for it for why the voter turnout is so high, ranging anywhere from the fact that, the parties are strong. We have lots of civic associations and nonprofits working. We've got organizations like the Midway Chamber of Commerce, and I'm serious, I'm not just pandering here, which are very good at what? Getting out information, encouraging people to vote. And also, people forget about this, Ramsey County, actually one of the better predictors of voting is religiosity, church attendance. And Ramsey County still remains, as many of you know, a fairly high church attendance. Lots of people I know still go, and I think all that comes together here. Okay, while not official, doesn't the certification typically enable a transition based on the call election results and not certified, at least in years past? Yes, generally, general services does that. Although if you saw the papers like I've done, I think what the Washington Post or New York Times, or can't remember, Wall Street Journal, whichever one I saw this morning, said that GSA is pushing back now on cooperating with the Biden administration or the Biden transition team after initially cooperating, and that is a break with the past. How does all this litigation legal team affect the date you gave us? 12/8, 12/8. Yeah. Are the states going to try to push up to officially call the election? Probably not. I think everything is going to move proceeding along the way it is. There are some people who are speculating that Trump's litigation goal is to try to what? Push it to a point where states can't certify, can't pass their, can't get their electors passed, and then throw it to Congress and hope the president maybe could win in Congress. But for the most part, these are all dates that I've given you that are just about either cast in federal stone or federal constitutional stone. So not a lot we can do about that. But just as I've told other people about this, let's say everything does get delayed. Let's say states can't certify. Let's say we can't get enough electoral votes passed. Let's say Congress can't figure out who to select as president, and we get to January 20th. At noon, Trump's term and Pence's term expire. We don't give them a holdover. They don't get to sort of say, well, we'll give you an extra 30 days extension or something like that. It's not like a tenant saying, or a landlord saying tenant gets to hang out a little bit longer. So the question is, if their terms expire, what happens? There's another law in place called the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 that says that if there's a vacancy in the presidency and the vice presidency, the line of succession then goes to where? The Speaker of the House. And so all push comes to shove, if enough delays occur, assuming Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House next year, which I think she will be, Nancy Pelosi becomes acting president of the United States, at least for a while. Okay, can I talk about Colorado electoral votes to the popular vote in future elections? An attendee asked about your overall thoughts about the Electoral College and how it gives more credence to land versus population. Yeah, what you're talking about here first is what's called the national popular vote, where states have said that we would cast our electoral votes in accordance with the national popular vote. That compact supposedly takes effect when enough states equivalent to 270 electoral votes have ratified it. I think Illinois was the most recent state to support it. I've endorsed it in theory, but at some time in the past, I'm less sure I support it now than I used to, for two reasons. One, I'm not sure it's constitutional. That interstate compacts require Congress to approve them. I'm not sure, absent congressional approval, that compact is constitutional. But I don't know. That's one question. The second, I'm not sure how I feel about this now. What if the state of Minnesota voted for candidate X? A majority voted for candidate X, but candidate Y wins the presidential election by the popular vote. How would Minnesotans feel to say that all of our electoral votes go for the person who didn't get the most popular vote in our state? I'm wondering politically what we might think about that. Okay. And then my thoughts on the Electoral College. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I actually think that if I could wave my magic wand, and I think I actually have one here, well, sort of a magic wand, if you can sort of see it here, my magic wand here, is that I would probably do the Maine and Nebraska model, award electoral votes on the basis of congressional districts, and which might be a little bit more fair. And in Minnesota, what that would mean is what people in greater Minnesota might actually get a say in the presidential election, because right now they haven't had a single elector for a Republican since 1972. And then in other states, Democrats haven't had a single elector in probably, I don't know how long also. So I would probably go in that direction myself to develop it more. There are reports that many in the swing states, there's a substantial evidence of 1,000 ballots where the voter only marked the ballot for the presidential candidate, and these ballots were exclusively for the Vice President Biden. Any comment? Possibly, I haven't seen it. We do know there's a huge drop off from the presidential ballot down to the other races. I wouldn't be surprised if a ton of people came in and just said they knew they didn't like Donald Trump and voted for Joe Biden. Again, reinforcing my point of saying that this was really an election, I think, just about Donald Trump. So again, I haven't seen much of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. All right, so I've got those questions out. Okay, are there other questions people want to ask me? I think I've managed to get to all of them in the chat box.
Could you talk about your predictions, if you have any, for the Georgia runoff elections?
Boy. Well, the first off, I was going to say, I still want to get to our state stuff here in a second here. I first off want to say that all of us are in the wrong business. And what I mean by that, I'm going to guess that those two races in Georgia, by the time all the money comes in from both parties and third parties, it'll be $100 million for the two of them. So for those of you who are, I don't know if any of you here are in the business of selling television advertising. It's time for us to move down to Georgia and sell television advertising on a commission basis for the next few weeks, because it could be incredible. I think Democrats generally don't do as well in runoff elections as they do in general elections. So I would give a slight nod to the Republicans, but I could actually see this splitting because I'm forgetting the names of the candidates now there. But one of the candidates, the Democrat, actually looked like she was going to win the general election if it were just on straight vote without having to go runoff. So I could see a scenario where they split down there, but I'm more likely thinking the Republicans are going to pick up unless Democrats can somehow figure out how to bring in that same support that apparently flipped Georgia in the presidential to do it there. So I'm sort of leaning towards Republican at this point. Okay, quick deadline. The one after December 8th. December 8th is the safe harbor provision, and then December 14th is the Electoral College casting of ballots. January 6th is when joint session of Congress meets to review and verify the electoral votes, and then January 20th is the date when the next president is sworn in. At the state level, by the way, again, whether I'm just dumb luck or a good predictor, I thought all along, and I don't think anybody predicted that the Republicans were going to flip the House. I know there were some Republicans who were convinced they would, but I don't think Kurt Doubt was thinking, yeah, we're going to flip, but I never thought they would. I also thought that the Democrats would not flip the Minnesota Senate. I thought that that the final number would be 34-33, and that's exactly what it turned out. The Democrats initially had to flip 2 seats, but I also said that there are only about 7 or so competitive Minnesota Senate seats. The Democrats would have to flip 2, but it was going to probably lose at least 1 or 2 in greater Minnesota. And therefore, the Democrats would probably have to really flip about 4 or 5 seats, a pretty tough call. At the end of the day, they weren't able to do it. The way I describe it is that the blue wave of 2018 basically picked up as many seats as it could in the House, couldn't go any further. And there wasn't much more room to move in terms of the Senate at that point. So no surprise there. What it means, of course, for the state of Minnesota, and now let's think about the national, that even if the Democrats do pick up both seats in the US Senate and it goes 50-50, it's a tie. Now, Kamala Harris gets to break the ties as the vice president is allowed to do, which means she's going to be busy for a long time. But because of the filibuster rule, it's going to be very difficult to move anything. Filibuster rule requiring 60 votes to move things in the Senate if somebody objects and wants to filibuster. There was rumors that the Biden administration might pursue getting rid of the filibuster rule or asking the Senate to do it. Joe Manchin, who's a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, said yesterday he wouldn't support that. Essentially means what? We're not going to see that removed. Republicans are going to be able to prevent major pieces of legislation from moving at the national level. It's probably incremental change. It might border on gridlock again. And then in state of Minnesota, the fact that we've got split government again suggests to me that we're not going to see significant policy changes. And think about some of the challenges next year. Was it yesterday I heard on the radio, and maybe you folks can verify this? I think what now? The state budget deficit for the current biennium is several billions of dollars. That's going to have to be made up next session. And then going into the next budget session, next biennium, we're probably several billion in the hole too. So it's going to be a really, really tough session in terms of it. And I'm not sure how much political unity there's going to be to address some of these problems.
I've got another question for you. Assuming that the vote becomes official and Joe Biden is our next president on January 20th, what can we expect from the current administration in the last 2 months in terms of any policy, executive orders, or anything else?
Okay, first, Congress and the president do have to agree on a budget or at least a continuing resolution bill. Otherwise, we have a government shutdown. I think it's likely that will happen. As is typical, but I don't expect any major legislation between now and the end of the year. As is typical with outgoing presidents, they issue a flurry of executive orders to try to sort of cement their legacy into stone. Some of those executive orders will be easy to overturn because they don't carry the force of law. Some of them will carry the force of law and will be more complicated to address. Joe Biden, in an interview in the last couple of days, has announced that he's ready to move on January 20th with at least 20 different executive orders to try to reverse many of the Trump ones. So I suspect we'll see executive orders, counter executive orders, and court challenges to both the executive orders issued by Donald Trump and new ones issued by Joe Biden. But in the next couple of months, I think the main focus is going to probably be on what? I think Congress is going to come back, pass some kind of short-term spending bill, kick the can down the line for at least a couple of months, and then get out of town in a hurry. But given the fact that the Democrats aren't going to agree to much serious changes in legislation, or the Republicans or Trump on the other hand, I just don't see much more happening besides the basic budgetary stuff to keep the lights open for the federal government.
Thank you. We have time probably for 1 or 2 more questions. Does anybody have anything else they'd like Professor Schultz to go over? Looks like we had a question pop up, I believe, about stimulus money. Would there be any more stimulus funding coming?
I think eventually, again, I don't think it's going to happen before Biden takes over. I would be surprised. Pelosi McConnell and Trump seem very far apart on this, but it's conceivable for some of it, but unlikely. I think it's pretty likely that the Biden administration will come across with some, and there'll be some help. How much it is, I don't know. I mean, I think the state of Minnesota is counting on a big chunk of stimulus money to bail them out, as is, I think, lots of local governments and so forth. I think that'll be the biggest initiative that Biden will start off with. I don't know how much it'll be. It's going to be well over $1 trillion again, probably also. But that's probably what it's going to be. I would just be incredibly surprised if after the election, and I think, let me put it this way, if there's any window, the window for doing anything with the stimulus bill comes after the litigation is over. I just don't think we're going to see any litigation or any major legislation between now and, let's say, December 8th or December 14th. Both sides are going to still be jockeying for position. There's a new book out by Tom Ricks called The Founding Principles. There's a lot in it, but one idea he highlights is Madison's thought that gridlock is a feature of government, that our system is designed to force people in disagreement. Gridlock, that's a good thing. When they don't, gridlock happens. You're right. Our system is designed to require high degrees of consensus and high degrees of working together. And what we need to, and it's basically to prevent any one group from basically pushing another group around. And what we haven't had now is the incentive structures. And what I mean by that, our framers presupposed in 1787 that political parties would not exist. George Washington, in his farewell speech of 1796, bemoaned the fact that parties were going to form, and said, parties will be factions that divide this country. And the reason why I mention it is that there may be a sense in which old George got it right, in the sense that our system was designed to ensure compromise and working together, but to what extent, especially now, with the rigidity of the parties now, is that preventing that from occurring? And I think that's a problem. When Kamala Harris steps down from the Senate, and who gets to replace her? I think in California the governor does, but they may have to do a special election afterwards. But I'm not sure. Where do you see the Democrats of the country moving in terms of political fashion? Does it favor Republicans or Democrats? It sort of favors Democrats, but not quite, in the sense that the new generations coming up don't particularly like what the Democrats or the Republicans stand for, and view the issues differently. For example, a lot of my students, even my students at Hamline who identify themselves as Republican, also identify themselves as pro-LGBTQ and supportive of reproductive rights. To them, it's all about It's all about economics issues. And so I think both parties are going to be facing this challenge down the line of how to recruit a new generation of people who have a different set of values that may break with the previous two generations. And there's been some firing of high-level cabinet positions in the last few days. How will this affect Biden if he's officially named the president? There'll probably be some, acting people there who are going to be like the higher level senior executive service people who are going to basically be the caretakers. It probably will not have that big of an impact, in the sense that government's going to kind of go on autopilot for a while, and he'll just sort of come in, put his people in, and take over the autopilot.
I think that answers our questions, and we are also after 12:30. So I think you need to be heading out to your next thing, Professor. And
next class, yep.
So thank you so much for your time. This was, once again, very helpful, very informative. This is recorded, so we'll be able to send it out to everybody. And I hope you can join us for our next event on Thursday. It's another one of our celebration of nonprofit events. This one about the survey results from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. So please join us for that. Thank you again to Minnesota Lawyer for their sponsorship today. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, folks. Talk to you again.
Thank you.